help, something that works, someone who can protect us. And when we turn to God, especially, I think, in our time, we find our picture of God has just been so thinned out, just by culture, by modern assumptions, and even by shallow religion. And so when we need God most, we reach for God, and it's like it doesn't work. I mean, I'm not kidding. I have this conversation at least twice a week. And it's the very thing Nietzsche was trying to warn us about. We thought eliminating the strictures of religion would make us feel more free. And in some ways, I suppose that's true. But what we didn't see coming was the problem of pain. What are we going to do with our suffering? And the Christian faith is all about what we do with our pain and how we make meaning in a world that can feel so meaningless. Wrestling with these questions was supposed to be the task of religion. But for the last few generations, the American church has not been doing very well at this. I mean, you can just kind of walk through it. Liberal Protestantism has been brought to heel by capitalism and commerce. It's domesticated to the point where one of my heroes, Stanley Hauerwas, he's fond of saying, liberal Protestants only have one conviction left, and that is that God is nice, so we should be nice. That's all we have. And that's sentimentality. It's just like no help. The evangelicals have splintered into factions. There's kind of the prosperity gospel folks who blame suffering on a lack of faith. There's the gospel coalition and kind of neo-reformed guys who boil everything down to doctrinal purity, so they blame it on apostasy. And then there's the Christian nationalists who have taken, honestly, the most surprising tack to me, without even knowing it, I think. They've actually embraced Nietzsche's solution to the problem. If God is dead, then he said all that's left is the will to power. It's a kind of social Darwinism. Just forget about neighborly concern and social justice and morality. Just take the world by the horns and impose your will on it. It's like an unqualified embrace of radical individualism and power and even violence. And this is basically what we got in American Christianity. A kind of certitude or sentimentality. And by the way, I'm not sniping from the sidelines here. I have dabbled in all of these at one time or another in my life. And I'm telling you, they're not enough. When faced with human suffering, they're not enough. They are either no consolation or they turn God and or us into monsters. I mean, to say God has a plan to somebody who is just going through hell is cruel. And certitudes and powering up, the will to power. I mean, this is the philosophy of the Third Reich and the German church who went along with it and are still dealing with that. We're living in a culture that has intentionally moved beyond God, and at the same time, the church has become kind of shallow and just full of sentimentality and certitudes. And so just by virtue of having grown up in our society, our capacity to experience God has kind of been dulled. It's like our souls have atrophied. We've kind of gone numb. Our sensitivity's gone. Or we've fallen asleep. And so when suffering breaks in and our systems and solutions can't fix it, we turn to God and God doesn't solve it. What's left for us but to blame God and each other? And this is where I think we are. More than anything else, I think it's the question of suffering that is really kind of feeding this lack of ability to believe in God. And I think something within us, even with all of this in mind, still longs for God, still aches for meaning. And we're kind of the only creatures that have this strange glory, but also terrible burden. The sense that there's something beyond, or that maybe the beyond is inside us somehow. That God has set eternity in the hearts of men. And we can't prove it in a lab. There's no study. but the hunch hangs over our lives. It's like feeling homesick for a place we've never been. This feeling there has to be more. There's something missing. It haunts us and disturbs us, and we can't let it go, and we wouldn't want to even if we could. And this brings us to our story for today, the Transfiguration of Christ. And I want to suggest that the Transfiguration is actually a story about the problem of pain and suffering. It's about a bunch of things, but it's definitely about this. And about how Christ revolutionized our understanding of God and what God plans to do about it. And so I want to move us quickly through the text and try to let it speak to the problem of suffering. Just to put it in context, we pick up this story right after Jesus has fed the 5,000, which has all this deep symbolic meaning. Then he goes off in private to pray. His disciples go with him, and they get to talk, and he says, "Who do people say I am?" And they basically say, you're a prophet. You're going to rattle the cage of our leaders. And he says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter speaks for all of them. He says, "You're the Messiah. And you're going to emancipate the people of God." And Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody this." It's kind of a weird thing to say. And people fight over it, but I think the most obvious reason he said this is that in first century Judaism, their ideas about Messiah were kind of all over the place, but almost all of them were essentially violent. And they were just violent people living in a violent world, and their imaginations could only entertain a violent messianic figure, a warrior king. And so when he says, "Don't talk about me being Messiah," it's because they don't know what that even means to him. So he'd have to redefine their understanding through his teaching and ministry and ultimately death and resurrection. If they start talking about Messiah right now, they're just going to get it wrong. People are going to want him to raise an army and start a war, and that's not what he's doing. And then right after that, the next thing that happens is this little teaching that's related to this. He says, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life." He's kind of like, that's my part. Here's your part. "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self?" And then the very next thing that happens is transfiguration. So his admonishment, don't tell anybody about the Messiah thing, and his teaching about suffering and cross-bearing and losing your life, it's still hanging in the air when he goes up on this mountain to pray with Peter, James, and John, and suddenly his appearance changed, and his clothes became white like lightning, and these two men appear, and we're told it's Elijah and Moses. No idea how they knew what those guys looked like. Maybe they had Facebook, but they appear, it says, in glorious splendor, and it says they were talking with Jesus, and Luke is the only one. He actually tells us what they're talking about. They're talking about his departure or death, depends on translation. The actual Greek word there is Exodus. They're talking about his Exodus with Moses. It's a little on the nose. Now, Moses and Elijah, they don't just show up here randomly. They're witnesses. Their stories kind of carry the shape of what Jesus is about to go through. Moses, if you remember, faced down Pharaoh, just the most powerful empire on earth, confronting his injustice and exploitation and bondage of the people of God. And Moses, if you remember, put their gods on trial, the gods of Egypt in the plagues, and then had to flee with the people to the wilderness for 40 years. And he also went up on a mountain to meet with God, and a mountain wrapped in cloud and fire. So it's transfiguration stuff. Elijah, the great prophet of justice, faced another corrupt regime, that of Ahab and Jezebel, who weaponized political power to enrich themselves. They just sort of fused throne and altar, co-opting the Jewish religion to fuel their fortunes. And Elijah confronted their idolatry and injustice and exploitation. He put the prophets of Baal on trial. Remember the thing with the altar and the fire and all that stuff? And then he fled to the wilderness for 40 days this time of trial and testing. Climbed the same mountain as Moses and there meets with God. So he led his own kind of exodus. Their stories have so much in common. Both were prophets, both were challenging corrupt leaders around injustice, around exploitation. Both fled to the wilderness for 40 days, 40 years. Both were miraculously fed with manna, with the ravens and the widow of Zarephath. Remember that story? Both met God on a mountain. Both encountered God's glory, God's presence. Both heard the voice of God in the thunder, in the still small voice. Both end up covering their faces with the veil on the way down. God oversaw both of their deaths. It says God buried Moses and Elijah's carried away in a chariot. I mean, these two stories are really paralleling each other. That's who shows up with Jesus. And they're talking about his exodus. And so this is signaling to us that what Jesus is doing is like what these guys did. It's a new exodus from suffering and injustice. And the cloud appears like it did for them. And the mountain rises and a voice speaks just like it did for them. But this time, God's glory isn't a reflection. It's shining from within Christ's own body. Which is when Peter and the other disciples enter the chat. And we learn that while all this has been going on, they've been asleep. In ancient literature, people who are sleeping, it means they're dull. They're uncomprehending. And then they awake to this fireworks show, and Peter has himself an idea. Let's build some tents. Tabernacles is the word. Let's stay up here, just camp out on the mountaintop. And then suddenly, a cloud descends on all of them, covers them. It's sometimes called the great cloud of unknowing. It shows up to protect people when God is too close. And this voice says, "This is my son, whom I've chosen. Listen to him." And then everything disappears. Moses, Elijah, the cloud, they go away. And it's Jesus with his guys. And then it has this little gloss. They didn't tell anybody what they had seen. All right, so step back for a second. Just think about this. So the progression starts with feeding the 5,000. They go off to pray. He says, who do people say I am? They say prophet. He says, who do you say I am? They say Messiah. And he's like, don't tell anybody. You don't know how to handle this information. And then he teaches them and says, I'm going to be killed on a Roman cross by the empire and by the religious guys. But I'll be raised in 3 days. And if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross and follow me. And if you try to save your life, you'll end up losing it. But if you'll lose it the way I'm talking, you'll save it. And then the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah talking about Exodus, the disciples sleeping through most of it. And then Peter wakes up, and his suggestion is symbolic. He's kind of a stand-in for all of us. This is what we would all want to say. Let's build some tents and stay up here on the mountain with your glory. Just grab hold of the glory and let's, ixnay with the oscray stuff. Let's not talk about the cross and resurrection stuff, or the laying down of lives. We're all supposed to get caught in the net there. And even the text is embarrassed for him. It says he didn't know what he was saying. And then the cloud descends, cloud of unknowing. And God's voice says, this is my son, listen to him. He's trying to teach you, in a sense, how the powers that keep you in bondage will be defeated. How my people can be emancipated. He has the words of life. You have to listen to him. And they did. And they kept quiet about the Messiah stuff until after the resurrection. Now, my assertion is that this story is about the problem of suffering. That God's actually revealing how God plans to deal with the powers of empire and evil and sin and death and injustice. Anything that exploits the people of God and keeps us from finding peace. And God's plan, as Jesus is laying it out here, seems to be to defeat those powers, not by muscling them out, but by exposing them, revealing their true nature. Not just overpowering evil in whatever form it comes, but by absorbing it with love. And Moses had glimpsed this. Elijah had a taste of it. But here on this mountain, what's revealed is that in the kingdom of God, the way of suffering is the way of glory. So it's not like suffering now, glory later. Like it's not transactional. It's that God is made visible. God appears within the confrontation with injustice and exploitation and the suffering that this involves. God's glory is seen in the Transfiguration here, lighting up a human being. And it doesn't cancel out injustice and suffering. He goes to the cross. It just reveals the truth about them, that when human beings agree to bear suffering faithfully in the struggle for shalom, for justice and goodness, in opposing corrupt leaders who crush the innocent and not turning to violence and evil themselves, but just bearing it in solidarity with the least of these, then God's glory will shine through human people who take up their cross. And the true nature of empire will be revealed for all to see, that it's corrupt, it's doomed. And slowly, too slowly, the world will reject that way and choose the better way, the way of love. And this is how empires fall and tyrants fail. In this strange economy of God, suffering and glory tracked together. The way of suffering is the way of glory. And the exodus Christ leads is a confrontation with the source of human suffering and injustice. The power to defeat it runs through cross and resurrection and through the wilderness. Now, we might want to ask why, Why not just identify the problem and eliminate it? And there are a lot of obvious reasons. One is that the line between good and evil doesn't run between people or communities. It runs down the center of every person and every community. So we can't eradicate evil without eradicating ourselves. Another reason is that violence like this always multiplies violence. The day after every revolution, the revolutionaries become monsters. And these are both very Christian ideas. But the third one that I want to focus on today is it really has to do with his context. He's trying to emancipate the people of God from imperial religion and the empire of Rome. That's who is stealing away their ability to find peace. It's basically the same machinery as Egypt, just different uniforms. He's trying to liberate his people and then extend that liberation to all nations, he says. And Moses and Elijah are there to remind us that a bit of polite negotiation with the Pharaoh or Caesar of the day isn't going to do anything. It won't even make a dent. These guys aren't going to end their abuses of people because they're feeling generous or start to care about the common good. They don't care about that. They care about keeping people quiet and compliant, and they care about consolidating wealth and power. And their power was beautifully consolidated in their time. The Sadducees controlled the temple. The Pharisees controlled the law and the synagogue. The Romans controlled the government and the largest military on the planet. They determined every aspect of life. And they were undefeated and well-organized and brutally effective. And there's just no war to be won against those guys. And this is how it is for all regimes. And Martin Luther King used to talk about it. He said one time, the choice is not between violence and nonviolence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. You choose to go to war against the empire and they'll annihilate you. You got to find another path. And Moses and Elijah are there because they knew the path from their story. It's an exodus that runs through the wilderness of pain. Not because God is a sadist who gets off on human anguish. That's empire. That's powerful. But because God's glory shines through human beings when they lay down their lives for each other. And this is how the world learns that the only thing stronger than hate is love. Jesus' exodus is rooted in a kind of love that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. His exodus wasn't a military uprising. It was an unveiling and unmasking of the powers on one hand. I mean, he doesn't defeat them by overpowering them, just exposing who they are by letting them exhaust themselves on his own body. The cross made their violence, their cruelty visible for all to see. And evil was clearly seen. And this is when it crumbles. Bonhoeffer talked about this. He said, the followers of Christ have been called to peace. His disciples keep the peace by choosing to endure suffering themselves rather than inflict it on others. They overcome evil with good and establish the peace of God in the midst of a world of war and hate. The theological idea behind this is it's called cruciformity. It just means a cross-formed life, allowing cross and resurrection to become the shape of our existence, who we are and how we exist in the world. It's imitating Jesus on the cross, forgiving his enemies, exposing what they are, but refusing to return violence and still calling it out as evil. And this both reveals the true nature of empire and religious empire, political empire is evil. And it reveals the glory of humanity in refusing to return in kind, refusing vengeance and violence, refusing to dehumanizing and choosing instead love and solidarity with the outcasts. When we do this, Jesus said, take up our cross and follow him, God's power is unleashed into the world. That's the promise. The power of love. And Jesus banks his whole deal on the idea that love is stronger than hate. And it's the only thing that can defeat the empires of religion and government or whatever it is that holds us in bondage. Now, cruciformity is dangerous. It's not masochism. You know what I mean? It's not pacifism or passivity. We get no enjoyment from suffering. We just refuse to inflict it on others and make us into monsters. We endure it while calling it evil. That's why it's not also passivity. I often call it militant nonviolence. I mean, it's an active loving of the neighbor that sets us in conflict with the powers of injustice, with empire. But we don't lose just to lose. We lose because we've chosen to love our neighbors and live in solidarity with the outcasts. And God's promise is our love will be revelatory. It will expose the truth about the world. It will be an unmasking of evil and those who abuse us because we stand in solidarity with the people they've chosen to abuse. And the true humanity of those who love this way will be, in this story, will be lit up with the glory of God. All of a sudden, God isn't academic. God is seeable, touchable, feelable. So it's not that Christ's glory is going to help us avoid suffering or win or kill the wicked. It's that Christ's glory, which is his cruciformity, transforms our suffering into this powerful form of revelation. God becomes real and visible in the world. And they can see it for their own eyes, the world can, and judge for themselves who's right and who's wrong. And the response is an outpouring of love that unleashes this power into the world from just regular people. And this is how the empires crumble. Cruciform love is the only power stronger than the empires of the world. That's part of what's being explored in the Transfiguration. It's what fells the tyrant and seats the powers of imperial religion and government. I mean, think about our history. Like, slavery was abolished by Christian abolitionists practicing cruciformity. Christian suffragists won the right to vote for women, practicing Christian cruciformity. The civil rights movement was founded on cruciformity and nonviolence. It just unleashes this power that it's the only thing that topples empire. And what I think Nietzsche missed is he was right about so much, but what he missed is this idea that there's just more power somehow in cruciform love. It just has the ability to make God seem so obviously real through regular old person's lives. God's presence in us, with us, living between us, binding us together. But this is not an easy path. I mean, the Exodus runs through the wilderness. And if we want to be his disciples, Jesus says we have to take up our cross and follow him. And if we get scared or angry and we try to save our life, it'll slip through our fingers. But if we'll lose it, for those on the margins, it will never end. There will be too much life for death to ever have a say. It's not that God is dead. It's just that God is made most alive and visible in the wilderness of suffering and then out the other side. And this is a very narrow road. This Wednesday, we began the season of Lent with Ash Wednesday, where we join Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. And the goal is to try to learn the deep wisdom of cruciform love. It's just a way of practicing and training ourselves to take up our cross, follow Jesus, be part of the power of love that topples all dehumanizing regimes. And so I invite all of you to come be a part of it this Wednesday. Take this 40-day journey together. Let's pray. God, we just confess that it seems impossible to us that this could work. But best we can, we're going to heed your voice from the cloud saying, "This is my son. He knows what he's talking about. You got to listen to him." And as we try to listen and obey, take up our cross, lay down our lives. Please, God, please don't leave us hanging. Show up in the world. Light us up with your spirit and your presence. Amen. If you would stand, please, and we're going to receive